So welcome to week 2. This week I'd like to talk about flipped teaching and flipped learning, mainly because I'd like to deconstruct the idea of the flipped classroom. I'm trying to avoid the notion that flipping the classroom simply involves putting instructional videos in Moodle, for example, to be viewed by students in advance of the in-class session, and then having active learning activities in class. So in other words, there might be the assumption that if you do both things, then you have flipped the classroom. And I would argue that that might not be the case. In fact, if you talk about flipping the classroom, it's not just about changing the instructional method. There will actually be changes in the way we do things, changes in our attitudes, changes in our thinking, changes in our behavior as well. And it's not just, it doesn't just involve changes on the part of the teacher, it will also involve changes in the student. And I'd like to emphasize that in speaking of the flipped classroom, for example, although we know that our broad objectives would be to enhance learning outcomes of students and improve their satisfaction as students, and then improve student retention, if you look at the flipped classroom approach, you're actually looking at 3 very specific objectives. And at the end of the day though, the question that we would like to ask is, how do we know that we have flipped the classroom? The kind of analogy I'd like to do is that I'd like you to look at this image on screen now. It would seem like looking at the flipped classroom involves doing 2 things: putting instructional videos in Moodle, and that is something that we hope students will access in advance of the in-class session, and then having active learning strategies in class. But actually beneath those 2 elements of a flipped classroom lie hidden very important elements of a flipped classroom, and which I would like to argue are part of what is known as a flipped learning environment. And these involved flipped teaching, flipped learning, and flipped teaching and learning activities. Now, these 3 elements of a flipped learning environment, flipped teaching, flipped learning, and flipped teaching and learning activities, these are what I would like to cover this week, and these will be contained in the other video presentations I'd like to show you for this week. Now, I remember in the course of our discussion last week, in the course of our online synchronous sessions, that there were a few of you who asked, okay, so what does the flipped classroom mean for me if my students are mainly distance education students, or if my students are mainly international students? Now, at this point, I will not be able to answer those questions, but actually I'm beginning to answer those in the Moodle forum. But I can assure you that these are themes we will cover in week 3 and mainly in week 4 when we look at the online flipped classroom. Now, going back to that issue of the flipped learning environment and the iceberg metaphor, to me, it's like, having a student of business, for example, saying, "Oh, I'd like to compete against McDonald's, because to me, the McDonald's hamburger, is quite tasteless. So if I come up with a better hamburger, then I might become a successful entrepreneur." And he looks at the success of McDonald's purely from the viewpoint, perhaps, of the product and perhaps the fancy restaurants that he sees. But we do know that behind the success of McDonald's is a very strong infrastructure that focuses on service, that focuses on reliability. And unless those key issues are addressed in a business environment, it's hopeless for another person to actually compete against McDonald's. The engineers would also say that, again, looking at a metaphor of having a building constructed, for example, somebody would say, "Oh, so that's what putting up a building involves. You just get pillars, get a carpenter to do this and that, put in masonry and so on." But obviously, again, the task of putting a building takes and requires more than that. And so beneath beneath what we see are some invisible elements of what makes for a successful project, for instance. And that is what I would like to discover and take up in the course of in this week concerning flip teaching and flip learning. So I welcome you to watch the succeeding videos.